Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, before Harriet Beecher Stowe shook a nation with a single book, she lived a quieter, stranger life full of grief, religious doubt, and secrets her admirers never wanted you to know. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Let the weight of the day begin to settle into the surface beneath you, the mattress or the pillow or the quiet darkness pressing gently against your body like a tide coming in. We are going to travel tonight. Not far. Not dramatically. We are going to a place of candles and ink and cold Ohio winters and kitchens that smelled of bread and wood smoke, or a young woman sat at a table surrounded by 7 children and a stack of papers she had no time to write on. She would one day write a book that changed the world. But tonight, we are not going to that book. Tonight, we are going to her. The life she lived before anyone knew her name. The years of struggle and sorrow and quiet, stubborn becoming. Come gently with us now. Into her story. Part 1, The House That Made Her, Litchfield, 1811. Into this house, on June 14, 1811, a daughter is born. She is the 7th child, and her mother names her Harriet Elizabeth Beecher, after a beloved friend. The name Harriet means something like ruler of the home, which will prove, in its own way, quietly prophetic. She is a small, serious baby who grows into a small, serious child. She has her mother's dark eyes and something of her father's restless mind, a quality of constant interior movement, of thoughts turning over and over like stones in a river, being smoothed into something clearer. The landscape of her early childhood is the landscape of New England in its particular, autumnal glory. Litchfield sits on a ridge in western Connecticut, surrounded by hills that go golden and red every October in a way that feels almost unbearable in its beauty. The town itself is prosperous and orderly, full of lawyers and merchants and the kind of genteel Calvinist culture that holds education in high regard and sin in slightly higher regard still. There is a famous school for young women here, the Litchfield Female Academy, founded by Sarah Pierce, and the Beecher children grow up in an atmosphere that takes the education of women seriously, at least more seriously than most of America in the early 19th century. But the world of Litchfield is not all hills and golden light. There is a darkness at its edges, and Harriet feels it early. Not the theological darkness her father preaches about, though she feels that too, deeply and uncomfortably, but something more intimate. Something closer. Her mother, Roxana Foote Beecher, is a woman of extraordinary quiet strength. Harriet will later describe her as someone who seemed lit from within, a woman who could make a room feel warmer simply by being in it. She painted. She read. She managed a household of extraordinary complexity with a kind of serene competence that bordered on the miraculous. And she died when Harriet was 4 years old. Roxana Beecher died of tuberculosis, which in 1816 was a death that came slowly and then all at once. She was 34 years old. She left behind 8 children, the youngest not yet a year old. Harriet would spend the rest of her life trying to recover the image of her mother from the fragments of memory available to her. She would ask her older siblings what their mother was like. She would ask her Aunt Harriet Foote, who came to help raise the children. She would construct her mother from second-hand accounts the way an archaeologist reconstructs a vase from shards, carefully, tenderly, always aware that something is missing. This loss, this foundational, shaping absence, would run like a current through everything Harriet Beecher Stowe would ever write. Her most powerful fiction is full of mothers. Full of the terror of losing them, the grief of missing them, the desperate love that children feel for the women who hold them. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Harriet is 4 years old, and her mother is gone, and the house at the top of the hill in Litchfield is a little quieter, and a little colder, and the small dark-eyed girl who will one day astonish the world is just learning what grief tastes like. Her father remarries within 3 years. His new wife is Harriet Porter, a woman from a distinguished Portland family who is genteel and capable but who does not, in the way that matters most to a small child, feel like a mother. Harriet grows up calling her mother because it is required of her. But she keeps the true image of Roxana reconstructed, cherished, slightly mythologized, locked somewhere deep inside her, where it will warm her like a coal for the rest of her life. The older Beecher children, Catherine, William, Edward, become the real shapers of Harriet's early intellectual life. Catherine in particular, 4 years her elder, becomes a kind of surrogate guide and challenger, pushing Harriet toward books and ideas the way you might push a bird toward the open door of its cage. Harriet reads voraciously, in the way that children who are largely left to their own devices often do. She reads the Bible, which is omnipresent, which is practically the wallpaper of the Beecher household. She reads history and poetry. She discovers Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott at the age of about 10, and it produces in her what she will later describe as one of the most vivid literary experiences of her life, the particular vertigo of being transported entirely out of your own world and into someone else's. She also writes. Of course she writes. In the Beecher household, writing is as natural as breathing. Her father writes sermons. Her siblings write letters. They debate, they argue, they express themselves in words the way other families might express themselves in music or in silence. Harriet's earliest surviving composition is a piece she wrote at age 10 for a school competition. It was on the subject, "Can the immortality of the soul be proved by the light of nature?" It is a remarkable question for a 10-year-old to be asked, and Harriet's response is remarkable in its own right, earnest, orderly, already showing a capacity for sustained argument that her father recognizes and is proud of, perhaps without quite knowing how to say so. Lyman Beecher is, in many ways, a difficult man to have as a father. He is often absent, consumed by his ministry and his theological battles. He has passionate convictions and expresses them at full volume. He is warm but inconsistent, admiring but demanding. He reads Harriet's composition at the school public day and asks afterward, with what sounds like genuine surprise, who wrote it. When told it was his daughter, he is quiet for a moment. She is a genius, he says. It is one of the most important sentences anyone will ever say to Harriet Beecher. Not because it changes what she does, she was already writing, already reading, already becoming, but because it names something she has felt inside herself without having words for it. She will carry that sentence with her. Even through the years when writing feels impossible. Even through the years when she has no time and no quiet and no table of her own. Even then, she takes all of it into the rest of her life. Into the pages of everything she will ever write. Part 2, The Sisterhood, Catherine's School and the Education of a Mind. There is a woman standing at a blackboard in Hartford, Connecticut, in the year 1824. She is young, 23 years old, and she holds the chalk with the confidence of someone who has decided that the world will be educated whether it wants to be or not. Her name is Catherine Beecher, and she has recently lost her fiancé to a drowning accident, and instead of collapsing under that grief, she has done something extraordinary. She has opened a school. Catherine Beecher will become one of the most important educators of 19th century America. She will spend her life arguing, with fierce and methodical passion, that women must be educated, not merely ornamented, not merely prepared for the drawing room, but genuinely, rigorously educated in the sciences and the arts and the practical management of household and society. She will disagree with her sister Harriet on many things. They will argue about religion and politics and the proper role of women in public life. But in this early season, Catherine is Harriet's greatest teacher and greatest advocate. Harriet arrives at Catherine's Hartford Female Seminary in 1824, at the age of 13, not as a student exactly but as something between student and assistant. She is small and quiet and terrifyingly sharp. She reads Latin. She writes compositions that her teachers find disconcerting in their maturity. She is not what you would call happy, not in the easy, uncomplicated way of childhood happiness, but she is engaged, which for Harriet is perhaps more important. Her mind is engaged, and when Harriet's mind is engaged, she is, in some essential sense, alive. The Hartford Female Seminary is a remarkable institution. It is housed in a series of rooms that are never quite warm enough in winter and never quite cool enough in summer, staffed by a rotating cast of young women who are, in many cases, educating themselves as they educate others. The curriculum is serious as composition, history, geography, mathematics, natural philosophy, rhetoric. The students are expected not merely to absorb information but to think about it, to argue with it, to write about it in ways that show genuine comprehension. For Harriet, this environment is both exhilarating and, in certain hours, excruciating. Because Harriet has a complicated relationship with her own mind. She is, she knows, capable of great things. She has been told this by her father, whom she fears and admires in roughly equal measure. But she is also, by temperament, deeply anxious. She worries. She doubts. She lies awake at night turning problems over and over, finding new angles to worry about just when she thought she had exhausted the supply. This anxiety is, in part, theological. The Calvinist tradition in which the Beechers are immersed is not, to put it gently, a tradition that encourages equanimity. It is a tradition that concerns itself with election and damnation, with the state of one's soul, with the question of whether you are saved, genuinely saved, not just performing salvation, but actually among the elect. For a child of Lyman Beecher's household, this question is not abstract. It is urgent. It is personal. It is the question that sits at the breakfast table and the dinner table and the bedside and the church pew and will not be quieted. Harriet, as a teenager at the Hartford Seminary, enters what she will later call a period of dark and terrible conflict. She is trying to find God, not the God of her father's sermons, which sometimes feels like a God made of lightning and judgment, but a God she can actually live with, a God who feels like love rather than like a test she might fail. She prays. She reads. She talks to Catherine, who is navigating her own version of this conflict following the loss of her fiancé. She talks to Edward, her brother, who is training for the ministry. She does not resolve this conflict quickly. It will follow her for years, rising and receding like a tide, shaping her emotional life in ways she does not always understand. But at the seminary, surrounded by books and argument and the companionship of other serious-minded young women, she begins to find something that helps. She begins to find it in writing. Not in the argumentative essays her teachers assign, but in something quieter and more private, in the practice of putting words to experience, of sitting very still with a feeling and trying to find the language that fits it precisely. She also begins to find it in friendship. The Hartford Seminary introduces Harriet to a world of female intellectual companionship that she has not had before, and it is revelatory. She becomes close to women who read and think and argue and laugh, women who take their own minds seriously without apology, and something in Harriet relaxes around them. Not entirely, she will never be an entirely relaxed person, but enough. Enough to feel that she belongs somewhere. By the time she is 16, she is no longer merely a student at the seminary. She is teaching there painting and composition, the two subjects she knows best. She is shy in front of a class in a way that surprises her, given how confidently her mind moves through ideas. But she gets better. She learns to project a calm she does not always feel. She learns to ask the question that opens a door rather than the question that closes one. She learns, in other words, to teach. And she writes. In the margins of her teaching duties and her studies, she writes small pieces, compositions, a play, or something like a play, about biblical figures. Little essays that exist somewhere between argument and meditation. Catherine notices, and encourages her, and also, being Catherine, directs her toward usefulness. Catherine believes in women's education not as an end in itself but as preparation for service, for the great project of civilizing America through well-educated wives and mothers and teachers. Harriet is not sure she agrees with all of this. But she is not sure enough of her disagreement to say so yet. That will come later. For now, she teaches and studies and writes her small pieces and lies awake worrying about the state of her soul and the direction of her life, and the winters in Hartford are cold and the summers are brief and golden, and she is becoming, slowly, steadily, in the way that rivers wear down stone, exactly who she is going to be. Part 3, The Move West, Cincinnati and the Semicolon Club. There is a river at the heart of this part of the story. Not a peaceful river. Not a decorative river. The Ohio River, which in the 1830s is something closer to a wound in the geography of a divided nation, a bright, cold, moving line between the state of Ohio, where slavery is illegal, and the state of Kentucky, where it is not. Stand on the Ohio shore and look south across that water and you are looking at a different world. A world organized around a system of forced labor so total, so consuming, so violently maintained that it shapes everything it touches, the economy, the culture, the landscape, the language, the silences. Harriet Beecher comes to this river in 1832, when she is 21 years old and her father moves the family to Cincinnati to become the president of Lane Theological Seminary. It will be one of the most formative chapters of her life. She will spend 18 years in Cincinnati, nearly 2 decades, and by the time she leaves, she will have married, given birth to 7 children, buried a son, nearly died herself, and witnessed the institution of slavery up close in ways that she cannot unknow and cannot forget. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. Let us begin at the beginning of Cincinnati. The city in 1832 is a boomtown. It is large and loud and energetic in the way of American cities in the era of rapid westward expansion, full of newcomers, full of enterprise, full of the particular chaotic vitality of a place that is still deciding what it wants to be. It has a river front busy with steamboats and commerce. It has churches of every denomination. It has newspapers and taverns and a growing intellectual class that is, perhaps surprisingly, quite sophisticated. It has also, just across the river, slavery. Harriet arrives with Catherine, who immediately sets about establishing another school, the Western Female Institute, and enlisting Harriet as her primary assistant. Harriet teaches, and struggles with the teaching, and misses Connecticut in the way that New Englanders always miss Connecticut when they leave it, with a particular grief for the specific quality of Eastern light, the particular clarity of it, that you do not find anywhere else. But something else is happening too, something more quietly exhilarating. Cincinnati has a literary culture. It has a circle of educated, curious people, men and women both, who gather to read and discuss and write. And Harriet, through her father's connections and her own emerging reputation as a sharp and witty writer, finds her way into this circle. The Semicolon Club. The name sounds almost comical, but it is quite serious. It is a literary society, one of the most important in the Midwest in the 1830s, that meets weekly in members' homes to hear original compositions read aloud. Essays, stories, poetry, sketches of character or place. The rule is that every piece is read anonymously, so that the work is judged on its merits rather than on the reputation or gender of its author. This is where Harriet Beecher first becomes, in some meaningful sense, a writer. Not just a person who writes, but a writer, someone who writes for an audience, who feels the particular electricity of words landing on other people, who receives the response of a room and learns from it. She begins to submit pieces to the Semicolon Club with a nervousness so intense it is almost physical. She worries that her work is not good enough, that the audience will find it thin, that she will expose herself somehow in the act of sharing it. And then the piece is read, and the room responds, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with a thoughtful silence, sometimes with discussion that goes on longer than the piece itself, and Harriet sits in the back of the room, anonymous, feeling something she will later describe as the strangest mixture of terror and delight she has ever known. Her early pieces for the Semicolon Club are mostly sketches, lightly fictionalized portraits of New England life, written with the kind of affectionate irony that comes from observing a culture both from inside it and from a distance. They are good. They are genuinely good. They have wit and warmth and a quality of precise observation, the ability to find the exact detail that unlocks a character, a moment, a place, that distinguishes them from the work of mere amateurs. James Hall, the editor of the Western Monthly magazine, hears one of these pieces read at the Semicolon Club and asks to publish it. Harriet's story, a New England sketch, appears in the Western Monthly magazine in 1833. It is her first professional publication. It wins a prize of $50, a significant sum, and it changes something in Harriet's sense of what is possible for her. She is 22 years old. She has just understood that she can do this. Not just write for herself, not just write for the closed circle of the Semicolon Club, but write for the world. That the world will receive what she writes. That it will even pay for what she writes. This is the moment, not the moment she sat down to write Uncle Tom's Cabin decades later, not the moment that book was published and transformed American life. This quiet moment in 1833 is the actual ignition point of Harriet Beecher Stowe's literary life. And it happens while she is also teaching and managing household duties for Catherine and negotiating the theological turbulence of her father's seminary and standing, sometimes, on the bank of the Ohio River, watching the water move south toward Kentucky, and trying to understand what she is looking at. The Ohio River would not let her go. It was always there, at the edge of everything, the edge of the city, the edge of her awareness, the edge of the moral world she was trying to understand. She could see, on clear days, the Kentucky shore. She heard stories. Stories brought across the river by escaped slaves, by abolitionists, by people who lived in the terrible interior of the institution and somehow found their way out. She listened to these stories with a quality of attention that was different from ordinary attention. More total. More disturbing. The kind of attention that does not let you put the thing down. She was becoming, in ways she did not yet fully understand, a writer in search of a subject large enough to hold everything she felt. Part 4, Calvin Stowe and the Marriage That Was a Partnership in the Dark. There is a man sitting in a study crowded with books, reading by candlelight. He is not especially handsome, in the conventional sense. He is earnest and somewhat rumpled, with the look of a man who has spent so long thinking about the ancient world that the present one sometimes surprises him. His name is Calvin Stowe, and he is a professor of biblical literature at Lane Theological Seminary, and he is very recently a widower, and he is about to fall in love with Harriet Beecher in the particular, helpless way of people who are perhaps not fully prepared to be in love with someone of her intelligence and complexity. Calvin Ellis Stowe is, by the standards of his time, a remarkable man. He is a genuine scholar, fluent in Hebrew and Greek, deeply versed in the history of biblical interpretation, possessed of an academic reputation that extends to Europe and that will eventually result in his being called to professorial positions at some of the most prestigious institutions in New England. He is also funny, in a dry and self-deprecating way. He knows how to laugh at himself, which is not as common as it should be. And he is, in certain respects, unexpectedly fragile. He suffers from what we might today recognize as severe anxiety and depression episodes that come upon him like weather, that lay him low for weeks at a time, that reduce this learned and capable man to a person who cannot function. Harriet knows about this fragility before she marries him. She knows it and accepts it, and in accepting it, she accepts a role that will define her domestic life for decades, the role of the stronger one, the one who holds things together, the one who manages the practical machinery of existence while her husband is somewhere else in his mind. They marry on January 6, 1836. Harriet is 24 years old. Calvin is 33. It is a winter wedding, which feels appropriate. There is a quality of seriousness to it, a quality of entering something immense and cold and potentially beautiful all at once. The marriage is, by every account, a genuine love match. They are attracted to each other's minds as much as anything else. The conversations between them are recorded in their letters as rich and argumentative and intellectually alive. Calvin respects Harriet's intelligence in a way that was not universal among husbands of the 1830s, to put it gently. He encourages her to write. He tells her, repeatedly and without apparent qualification, that she has a gift that must be used. He also, through no fault of his own, makes writing extremely difficult. Because what marriage produces, in rapid succession, is children. The first child, twin girls, arrives in September 1836, 8 months after the wedding. They are named Eliza Tyler and Harriet Beecher, after their respective grandmothers. They are healthy, demanding, bewildering in the way of all infants, these creatures that require absolutely everything and give back, in the early weeks, mostly noise and need. Harriet loves them with a ferocity that surprises her. She had not anticipated the particular violence of maternal love, how it sweeps away your prior sense of yourself and replaces it with something more primal and more complicated. A third child, Henry Ellis, follows in 1838. A fourth, Frederick William, in 1840. A fifth, Georgiana May, in 1843. A sixth, Samuel Charles, called Charlie, in 1848. A seventh, Charles Edward, in 1850. 7 children in 14 years. 7 children while also teaching, while also writing, while also managing a household with insufficient income and insufficient help, in a city far from her New England roots, on the wrong side of the Appalachians from everyone she had grown up with. The domestic life of Harriet Stowe in the Cincinnati years is extraordinary in its ordinary difficulty. The house is always slightly chaotic. Money is always tight. Calvin's salary from the seminary is modest and sometimes late, and Harriet's contributions from her writing are welcome but irregular. The work of feeding and clothing and educating 7 children, managing servants who come and go, maintaining a household that also serves as a kind of open door for the community of Lane Seminary, all of this falls primarily on Harriet. Calvin helps when he can. He is genuinely devoted to his family, genuinely loving. But he is also frequently ill, those episodes of depression and anxiety that remove him from the practical world for weeks at a time, and he is also frequently traveling, summoned to conferences and committees and the various obligations of his academic career. Harriet writes about this life in her letters in a tone that is remarkable, not bitter, not despairing, but honestly worn. She is tired. She is often overwhelmed. And she is also, somehow, maintaining the interior life of a writer even when she cannot sit down to write. She is observing. She is accumulating detail, the particular way a kitchen smells when bread is baking and a baby is crying and the fire needs tending, the texture of domestic life in all its unglamorous reality. She is learning, without entirely knowing she is learning, the material that will power some of the most vivid scenes in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Quaker kitchen, the warmth and order and love of domestic spaces that shelter the desperate and the fugitive. There is a moment in her letters from this period that stops the reader cold. Writing to Calvin when he is away on one of his many trips, she describes her day, the children, the house, the cooking, the teaching she is still occasionally doing, and then she writes, "I am sick of the smell of sour milk and sour baby, and everything seems dull and painful." It is such an honest sentence. Such an exhausted, clear-eyed, unsentimental sentence. She goes on, "And yet I never felt more strongly that I had something to do in the world." That is Harriet Stowe in the Cincinnati years. Both things, simultaneously. The exhaustion and the conviction. The mess and the vision. The sour milk and the sense of a larger purpose still moving in her, even when she cannot reach it. She also, in these years, experiences grief in a way that reshapes her fundamentally. Her infant son Charlie dies in 1849, during a cholera epidemic that sweeps through Cincinnati with terrifying speed. He is not quite a year old. He is strong and bright, and she loves him with the particular passionate love of a mother for a young baby, that love that is almost without language, that exists somewhere below words. And he is gone within days. Gone so fast that the loss has a quality of unreality, the mind cannot hold it. This grief, this specific, devastating grief, will surface again, transformed, transmuted into fiction, in the death of little Eva in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe herself will say, later, that she knew how it felt to lose a child, and that knowing was what allowed her to write the scene with the conviction it needed. But in 1849, standing over her son's grave in the hot Ohio summer, she is not a novelist drawing on experience. She is a mother. Just a mother, in her grief. Part 5, The Thunderstorm of Lane Abolition, Argument, and the World Across the River. There is a debate in the winter of 1834 that changes American history, though almost no one remembers it now. It happens in a series of evenings at Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, in one of those cold, lamplit rooms where men gather to argue about what they believe and what the world owes to the people who suffer in it. The Lane debates, as they are known, are organized by a group of students led by Theodore Dwight Weld, a firebrand abolitionist who has the kind of personal magnetism that makes people want to follow him even when they are not sure where he is going. Weld has traveled the South. He has seen slavery firsthand. He has come to Lane Seminary with the intention of converting its students to the cause of immediate abolition, not the gradual, managed, compensated emancipation that many reformers in the North were still debating, but immediate, unconditional freedom for all enslaved people. The debates go on for 18 evenings. They are attended by students, by faculty, and, in the way that extraordinary events attract observers, by members of the surrounding community. The arguments made there are among the most serious and sustained public arguments about slavery that have yet been made anywhere in America. They cover the history of the institution, its economic underpinnings, its moral dimensions, its practical implications for both the enslaved and the free. Lyman Beecher, the seminary's president, is uncomfortable with the debates. He believes in gradual emancipation, or perhaps more accurately, he believes in caution, in the careful management of volatile moral questions by people in authority, which at Lane means him. He does not shut the debates down, but he watches them with the expression of a man who knows something is getting away from him. Harriet is not in the room for the debates themselves. Women are not in the room, generally, for such formal proceedings. But she hears about them. She hears about them from her father, who is agitated. She hears about them from the community of Lane Seminary, which is alive with argument and outrage and conviction in equal measure. She hears about them from Theodore Weld himself, who becomes a figure in the Beecher social world. And she begins, in those conversations, to understand slavery differently. Not as an abstraction, a distant problem to be managed by politicians and ministers, but as a reality. As something that is happening, right now, to specific people, on the other side of the river she can see from the hills above Cincinnati. She also, in the Cincinnati years, crosses that river. She visits Kentucky. She sees, with her own eyes, something of the institution she has been hearing about. She stays with acquaintances at a farm and she sees enslaved people working, and the reality of it, the specific, embodied, human reality of people who are owned, does something to her. It is not a dramatic revelation. It is quieter than that. It is more like the way your eyes adjust to darkness, slowly, painfully, until you can see what was there all along. She also hears stories. Cincinnati is a crossing point for people escaping slavery. It is close enough to the Ohio River that the underground network of people who help freedom seekers is active and present. Some of these people, some of these stories, come through the world of the Beecher household. Harriet's brother Henry Ward Beecher is becoming a passionate advocate. Her father's congregation includes free black people and allies of the abolitionist movement. One story in particular stays with her. She hears, through this network of stories, about a woman who crossed the Ohio River in winter with a baby in her arms, crossed the ice, running, pursued by slave catchers, making it to the Ohio shore through what can only be described as desperation and grace. This story will become, years later, the scene that many readers consider the emotional climax of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the crossing of Eliza and her child. But in the 1830s, sitting in her Cincinnati parlor, Harriet just holds the story in her mind. Turns it over. Feels its weight. There is something happening in American public life in these years that gives these stories increasing urgency. The abolitionist movement is growing, and the slave states are growing correspondingly more aggressive in their resistance to it. The Fugitive Slave Act is not yet law, that comes later, but the legal and political framework that protects slavery is hardening, tightening, becoming more explicit and more punishing. Harriet watches this with the particular attention of a writer, which is to say, she watches the human cost of it. Not the political abstraction, but the actual people. The faces. The stories. The specific weight of what is being lost and defended and fought over. She is not, in the 1830s and 40s, an activist in the public sense. She does not speak at anti-slavery meetings. She does not publish abolitionist pamphlets under her own name. She is a woman with children and a household and a husband who is frequently away or unwell, and there are limits to what is possible for her. But she is thinking. She is always thinking. And the thinking is going somewhere, slowly, like a river finding its gradient, accumulating depth and force and direction. The world across the river is working on her. And she is working on it, in her mind, in the dark hours between a baby's feeding and the first light of morning, when the house is quiet and she has a few minutes alone with whatever is building inside her. Imagine writing a book on a kitchen table. Not a tidy kitchen. A kitchen with boots by the door and a pot on the fire and the sounds of children upstairs and a dog that keeps trying to get in through a door that doesn't latch properly. Imagine writing a book in the 15 minutes between getting the children to sleep and falling asleep yourself. In the margins of a teaching day. At a desk that doubles as a sewing table. This is where Harriet Stowe's literary life happens in the 1840s. Not in a study. Not in a room of her own. In the cracks and margins of a life that is overwhelmingly, relentlessly domestic. And yet, she writes. She keeps writing. She writes for money, which is not romantic but is real. The Stowe family finances are a source of constant low-level anxiety in the Cincinnati years. Calvin's salary is modest and irregular. The children need food, clothing, medicine, schooling. Harriet's writing, sold to magazines and newspapers and gift books, those popular anthologies of sentimental fiction and verse that were the hallmark cards of the 19th century, provides a real and necessary supplement to the family income. She also contributes regularly to Godey's Lady's Book, the most widely circulated women's magazine in America. Godey's is edited by Sarah Josepha Hale, a formidable woman who more or less defines the cultural expectations of educated American womanhood in the antebellum era. Hale publishes Harriet's work, and Harriet is grateful for the income and the visibility, and also slightly chafed by the restrictions of the form, the domestic scene, the moral lesson, the reassuring resolution. In 1843, a collection of her pieces is published under the title The Mayflower, or Sketches of Scenes and Characters Among the Descendants of the Pilgrims. It is her first book, and it is a modest success, reviewed kindly, sold in respectable numbers, noticed by people in the literary world who begin to add the name Harriet Beecher Stowe to their mental lists of writers to watch. Calvin Stowe is unambiguously proud. He writes to her from one of his many trips away. He is going to Prussia to study the Prussian education system, a journey that will have significant consequences for American education, that she is better than she knows. That she should write more. That the world needs her writing. She also finds an important influence in the reading she manages to do in those stolen hours. She reads Dickens, whose early novels arrive in America to enormous popular acclaim in the late 1830s. She responds to Dickens with a writer's response, not just pleasure, but professional attention. She notices how he handles sentiment without collapsing into it. How he makes you feel the full weight of social injustice without turning the characters into symbols. How he makes you care about people who are, on the face of it, very different from you. She is discovering that the life she is living, this chaotic, exhausting, deeply human domestic life, is not separate from her vocation as a writer. It is the substance of it, the material of it. The experience she is accumulating, whether she has time to write it down or not, is going to fill the pages of everything she writes. She just cannot see, yet, how large those pages are going to be. Part 7, The Cholera Year and the Descent into Darkness. The summer of 1849 in Cincinnati has a particular quality that survivors will remember for the rest of their lives. It is hot. The Ohio Valley in high summer is always hot, the heat heavy and thick, pressing down on the river and the city like something alive. But this summer there is something else in the heat. Something that comes with the heat, riding it, invisible and terrifying. Cholera. The epidemic of 1849 is one of the most devastating in American history. It moves through American cities with a speed and a lethality that the medicine of the time has no answer for. Cincinnati, with its dense population and its river commerce and its insufficient sanitation, is hit particularly hard. People fall ill in the morning and are dead by evening. The symptoms are severe and rapid dehydration, so extreme and so fast that the body simply cannot sustain itself. The city does what it can, which is not enough. The Stowe household is not spared. Charlie, Samuel Charles Stowe, 18 months old, the sixth child, the one Harriet had described as particularly strong and bright, falls ill in early summer. He deteriorates rapidly, in the way of cholera, faster than a mother's mind can follow. Harriet nurses him with everything she has. She does not sleep. She does not eat, not properly. She sits by his small bed in the heat and she prays with the ferocity of someone who has always been uncertain whether prayer works but who cannot stop trying. He dies. In July of 1849, Samuel Charles Stowe dies of cholera. He is not yet 2 years old. Calvin is away when it happens. He has gone ahead to Brunswick, Maine, where he has accepted a professorship at Bowdoin College and is preparing for the family's move to New England. He returns as quickly as he can, but Harriet faces the immediate hours of Charlie's death largely alone, surrounded by the other children, by servants, by friends and neighbors who come to help, but alone in the way that grief makes you alone. She writes to Calvin after the death with a directness that is almost unbearable. She writes about the blue eyes, the particular way he laughed, the exact weight of him in her arms. She writes about sitting with his body and thinking about God, not in the angry way you might expect, but in a more complicated way. She is asking God, in the only language available to her, to make this make sense. To show her how this loss connects to something larger, something purposeful. She does not get an answer, at least not immediately. What she gets instead is the specific education in grief that only this kind of loss can provide, the knowledge, now cellular and irreversible, of what it means to lose a child. She will bring this knowledge into her fiction. She cannot do otherwise. The death of little Eva in Uncle Tom's Cabin, that scene that made readers across the country weep openly, that is still cited as one of the most emotionally powerful passages in American fiction, is written by a woman who knows how to write it because she has lived something like it. Not the same. Fiction is never simply transcription. But the emotion is real. The weight of it is real. The precise, physical reality of watching a child die and being unable to prevent it, that knowledge is real. The cholera year also does something else to Harriet. It hardens her. Not in the sense of making her less feeling, she remains, throughout her life, a person of intense and readily available emotion. But it hardens her in the sense of clarifying what she is willing to spend her one life on. She has been writing for money, primarily. Writing the pieces the market will take, in the forms and registers the market prefers. She has been a professional woman of letters doing what is necessary to support her family. After Charlie's death, something shifts. Not immediately, not in a dramatic, blazing instant of conversion. But gradually, over the following months, as the family prepares to leave Cincinnati for Maine, she begins to feel with increasing urgency that she has something larger to write. Something she has been accumulating for nearly 20 years. The stories from across the river. The faces she has seen. The institution that turns people into property and calls it civilization. She is not yet sure how to write it. She is not yet sure she is strong enough to write it. The grief of Charlie's death has left her physically depleted. She is thin and often unwell, exhausted in ways that go beyond the merely physical. But she is sure of one thing. She is sure that she will write it. That she must write it. That the urgency she feels is not just personal, it is moral. It is the kind of urgency that does not allow you to put the thing down. The Stowe family leaves Cincinnati in the spring of 1850. Harriet Beecher Stowe is 38 years old. She is carrying her grief and her accumulated experience and her unwritten book. She is also, for the first time in years, heading toward New England. Heading home. Part 8, The New England Returned, Brunswick and the Gathering Storm. There is something about going back to New England that does something to Harriet Stowe's spirit. The cold, clear air. The quality of the light, that particular northeastern clarity that she has been missing for nearly 2 decades. The stone walls and the white steepled churches and the maple trees that are, in autumn, almost violent in their beauty. It is not the Litchfield of her childhood. She is in Brunswick, Maine now, a small college town where her husband is joining the faculty of Bowdoin College. But it is New England, and that alone restores something. Brunswick in 1850 is a quiet town, as most Maine towns are quiet, a quietness that has nothing to do with emptiness and everything to do with a particular quality of settled, self-contained life. The Bowdoin campus is old and dignified, lined with elms that arch over the paths in a way that feels like a cathedral. The house the Stowes move into is modest but sufficient, more sufficient, certainly, than the cramped quarters they often occupied in Cincinnati. Harriet feels the space, literally and metaphorically. But the political world in 1850 is not quiet. The year of the Stowes' return to New England is the year the Compromise of 1850 is passed, and with it the new Fugitive Slave Act. This is the legislation that changes everything for the abolitionist movement in the North, and that changes everything for Harriet Stowe specifically. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 requires that citizens of free states, ordinary people, not just law enforcement, must actively assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. It makes it a federal crime to harbor or assist a freedom seeker. It strips the alleged escaped slaves of virtually all legal protections, including the right to testify on their own behalf. It carries harsh penalties for non-compliance. The North responds with a fury that surprises even the most optimistic abolitionists. The act is not merely offensive to the sensibilities of anti-slavery Northerners, it is a direct personal demand. It is saying to every person in a free state, you must participate in this system. You cannot simply look away. You must help return these people to bondage, or you are a criminal. This is the moment that makes the abolitionist movement a mass movement, rather than the cause of a committed minority. And it is the moment that makes Harriet Stowe's book not just possible but necessary. Her sister-in-law Isabella Jones Beecher writes to her from Boston, where the impact of the law is being felt in the most direct way. Freedom seekers who had considered themselves safe in the city for years are now fleeing further north, to Canada, because nowhere in the United States can guarantee their safety. Isabella writes, "Harriet, if I could use a pen as you can, I would write something that would make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is." The account of what Harriet does when she reads this letter, according to her son Charles, who recorded the story from her memory, is one of those moments that becomes mythologized in literary history. She supposedly crushed the letter in her hands and said, or felt, with great certainty, "I will write something. I will if I live." Whether the moment happened exactly as described, whether it was quite so dramatic, quite so fully formed, is impossible to know. Memory has a way of shaping events into stories, of giving them the clean arc of narrative that actual life rarely produces in real time. But the essential truth is clearly accurate. By the end of 1850, Harriet Beecher Stowe has decided to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. She has decided to attempt the book that will, 2 years later, change the world. What she does not know yet is how long it will take. How hard it will be. How many hours she will spend at the kitchen table after the children are in bed, writing by the light of a single candle, going somewhere in her imagination that is both essential and devastating. She does not know, yet, the full dimensions of what she is about to do. But she is going to do it. Part 9, the theological soul, faith, doubt, and the moral engine of her work. There is a prayer that Harriet Stowe says every morning. Or tries to say, on the mornings when the children allow it, on the mornings when the noise of the household hasn't already swallowed the possibility of interior quiet. It is not a formal prayer, not the kind with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. It is more like a conversation with someone she is not always sure is listening. This is the most important thing to understand about Harriet Beecher Stowe's inner life. She is not a person of simple, uncomplicated faith. She is a person of enormous, struggling, complicated faith that was tested and interrogated and restructured repeatedly over the course of her life, faith that was the source of both her greatest comfort and her most profound anguish. Her father's Calvinism, the strict, demanding theology of predestination and election and the sovereignty of an inscrutable God, had shaped her childhood with something close to terror. Not just shaped it. Haunted it. The question of whether you were saved, genuinely saved, not merely performing salvation, was not, in the Beecher household, an academic question. It was the central question of existence. And for a child of Harriet's particular sensitivity and self-awareness, it was a question that could not be easily answered. She had, by the time of her marriage, moved away from the strictest Calvinism. She had found her way toward something warmer, a theology centered more on divine love and less on divine judgment, on the God who weeps at the tomb of Lazarus rather than the God who predestines souls to damnation. This movement was gradual and hard one, the result of years of reading and praying and suffering and recovering. The death of Charlie in 1849 accelerates this movement. Or perhaps more accurately, it clarifies what she actually believes, which is not the Calvinist God of her father's sermons, but a God of maternal love, a God who grieves, a God who is present in the suffering rather than distant from it. This theology, this particular, feminized, grief-soaked theology is the engine that drives Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is why the moral universe of the novel is organized around maternal love. Why the most powerful force in the book, the force that is set against slavery and that slavery cannot ultimately survive, is not argument or politics or law but love. The love of mothers for children, the love that slavery destroys by separating families, the love that, in the novel's theology, is the closest thing on earth to the love of God. She is also, in the years before the book, working through a second major theological question. The question of whether it is possible to do wrong in the name of right. Whether obedience to an unjust law like the Fugitive Slave Act is ever morally acceptable. This is a question with deep roots in Christian theology, going back through Augustine and Aquinas and the Reformation, and it is a question that the abolitionist movement is forcing into the public consciousness in the most urgent possible way. Harriet's answer is clear, though she arrives at it through genuine moral wrestling rather than simply adopting someone else's position. There is a law higher than the Fugitive Slave Act. There is a moral law grounded in the love of God and the dignity of human beings that supersedes any human legislation. And obedience to that higher law is not just permissible but required. This is the theological argument at the heart of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it will be received by its readers with the force of something they have been waiting to hear someone say. Not because it is new. Abolitionists have been making versions of this argument for decades, but because Harriet says it not as a theological proposition but as a story. As the story of people you have come to love, in whom you recognize something of yourself and your own children, being put in impossible situations by a system that is fundamentally opposed to everything you believe love to be. Her faith also sustains her in the practical challenge of writing the book. There are days, in the long months of composition, when she cannot see how to go on. When the material is too heavy, too painful, when she is too tired or too sick or too overwhelmed by her household responsibilities to find the necessary interior space. On those days, she prays. She tells herself, and tells Calvin in her letters, that this book is not entirely hers, that it was given to her by something larger than herself, that she is the instrument rather than the author. This is not false modesty. This is a genuine theological conviction that turns out to be psychologically very useful. If the book is God's, then she does not have to be adequate to it. She just has to be obedient to it. She just has to show up at the table and write the next sentence. The faith of Harriet Beecher Stowe is not the kind of faith that makes life easy or pain small. It is the kind of faith that makes life bearable. The kind of faith that says, the suffering is real, and the love is also real, and the love is larger. That conviction, suffering real, love larger, is the theological heart of everything she writes. It is the thing that makes her not just a polemicist, not just a propagandist for a cause, but a novelist. A real novelist. A writer who is trying to tell the truth about human experience in all its contradictory, painful, miraculous totality. Part 10, The Women Around Her, a Constellation of Influence. She did not become who she was alone. No one does. But in the case of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the network of women around her is so specific, so formative, so essential to the writer she becomes, that it deserves its own careful consideration. Let us begin with the women of her own family. Her mother, Roxana, lost at 4, but present always in the reconstructed image Harriet carried of her. Roxana Foote Beecher, who painted and read and managed an enormous household with quiet grace and who died at 34 of a disease that had no cure. Harriet spent a lifetime trying to know her mother, and in trying, created a kind of ideal of womanhood, educated, artistic, loving, spiritually alive, that ran through all her fiction. Every good woman in Harriet's novels has something of Roxana in her. Every home that functions as a sanctuary, a place of warmth and order and love, is built on the memory of what Roxana's home might have been. Harriet does not entirely agree with Catherine's conclusions. She does not think the solution to women's subordination is to celebrate and professionalize that subordination. She thinks the solution involves women having access to the same public spheres as men, including the sphere of published authorship, of speaking to the world. But Catherine's insistence on the dignity and importance of domestic life, on the home as a moral and social center, runs deep in Harriet's imagination. Her best fiction is saturated in domesticity, in kitchens and nurseries and sewing rooms, in the specific, sensory reality of women's daily work. Then there is Isabella Beecher Hooker. Isabella is Harriet's half-sister, the daughter of Lyman's second wife, 15 years younger than Harriet. She will become, in later life, one of the most prominent suffragists in America, a close ally of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, a woman who argues passionately and publicly for women's right to vote and to full legal personhood. In the years of Harriet's formation, Isabella is still young, still finding her way. But the conversations between them in letters, in the households they share periodically, are among the most stimulating in Harriet's intellectual life. And then there is Georgiana May. Not a Beecher, a friend, found in Hartford in the seminary years, a woman of deep intelligence and warmth who becomes one of Harriet's closest correspondents for decades. The letters between Harriet and Georgiana May are remarkable documents, frank and funny and deeply intimate, full of the ordinary and extraordinary events of both their lives. They are letters in which Harriet lets her guard down in ways she does not always do elsewhere. Letters in which she is not a daughter managing a father's expectations, or a student performing for a teacher, or a wife managing a household, or a writer meeting a deadline. She is just herself. It is to Georgiana May that Harriet writes some of her most honest accounts of the difficulty of the writing life. In one famous letter, she describes her attempt to write, in the midst of domestic chaos, in words that resonate with any writer who has ever tried to work in the margins of an overwhelming life. Since I began this note I have been called off at least a dozen times, once for the fish man, to buy a codfish, once to see a man who had brought me some barrels of apples, once to see a bookman, then to nurse the baby, then into the kitchen to make a chowder for dinner. This is the life out of which Uncle Tom's Cabin comes. The codfish and the apples and the baby and the chowder and the bookman, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the woman at the table with the pen and the vision and the refusal to stop. Beyond her family and personal friends, there are other women who influence Harriet Stowe's development as a writer. Lydia Maria Child, who publishes an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans in 1833 and loses many of her friends and much of her professional standing as a result, but who establishes a model of a woman who writes about slavery with moral seriousness and literary skill. Harriet reads Child. She admires her. She admires also the courage of the choice, the willingness to write something that will cost you something. There is also Eliza Cabot Follen, a Boston reformer and writer who corresponds with Harriet in the years before Uncle Tom's Cabin and who provides both encouragement and a kind of sanction, the sense that the intellectual and social circles of New England will receive what Harriet is working on. And there are the women she does not know personally but whose lives and stories come to her through the abolitionist network. Women who have escaped slavery. Women who have been separated from their children. Women who have lived inside the institution Harriet is writing about and carry the knowledge of it in their bodies in ways she cannot fully imagine but must try to honor. She writes with an awareness of these women that is not sentimentality. It is something more like obligation. The obligation of a writer who has access to a public platform and a language and an audience, to use those resources in the service of those who have none of the above. She does not work alone. She never did. Part 11, The 18 Years of Becoming What Cincinnati Left Behind. Before the book, there are 18 years in Cincinnati. 18 years that are, in a sense, the book's long gestation. The time in which all the material is accumulated, the stories, the faces, the theological arguments, the grief, the exhaustion, the moral clarity that arrives only through sustained confrontation with an unjust world. Let us walk through those years one more time, slowly, attending to the things we might have missed. Cincinnati in the 1830s and 40s is a city in genuine moral crisis. It sits at the border of the slave South and the free North, and that position creates a particular kind of social and moral tension, a tension between commerce and conscience, between the city's economic ties to the slave economy of the Mississippi Valley and the moral objections of its growing abolitionist community. The Lane Seminary debates of 1834 bring this tension to a head in a way that shapes the city's intellectual life for years. The students who organized the debates, Weld and his allies, are expelled when Lyman Beecher and the seminary's trustees become frightened of the controversy they are generating. Many of them leave for Oberlin College, which becomes the center of radical abolitionist education in Ohio. Harriet watches this drama unfold with the particular attention she brings to all moral conflicts, the attention of a writer, which is to say, attention not just to the arguments but to the people making them. She notices what it costs people to take a position. She notices the friendships that break over the slavery question, the professional consequences, the social consequences. She notices the people who would like to oppose slavery but do not want to pay that price. She notices them without contempt. She is too honest, and too aware of her own compromises, for contempt, but she notices. She also witnesses, in these years, the underground network that helps freedom seekers cross the river and move north. The Beecher household is not an official station on what will come to be called the Underground Railroad. That phrase is not yet in use, and the network is informal and deniable, more a web of individual decisions than an organized system. But people move through the Beecher world. Stories travel. John Rankin is a minister in Ripley, Ohio, whose house sits on a cliff above the Ohio River, lit with a lantern at night that freedom seekers can see from the Kentucky shore. Harriet hears about Rankin. She hears about the crossings, the desperate, midnight crossings, the people who wade through icy water or cross on ice floes in winter, the families who are separated and those who miraculously stay together. In Cincinnati she also meets formerly enslaved people whose accounts she absorbs with the fullness of attention she brings to everything that matters. She does not write about these meetings in detail in her published work. To do so would be to risk identifying people whose safety depended on anonymity. But the accounts are there, in the sediment of her imagination, and they surface years later in the specific, grounded humanity of the characters she creates. There is one encounter in particular that stays with her. Through the Beecher social world, she meets a woman, a free black woman living in Cincinnati, who has purchased her own freedom and the freedom of several of her children, but who has a daughter still enslaved across the river in Kentucky. The woman describes this situation, the child she can see from the Ohio shore on clear days, the child she cannot reach without breaking the law that protects her own freedom, with a calm that is more devastating than anger would be. Harriet listens. She holds the image. The mother on the free shore, looking south toward the child she cannot claim. That image, the geography of separation, the river as both boundary and wound, will run through Uncle Tom's Cabin like a musical theme, returning at every register, from the comic to the tragic. She also, in Cincinnati, begins to read the slave narratives that are starting to appear in print in the 1830s and 40s. Frederick Douglass publishes his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845, and it is among the most important texts Harriet encounters. It is not just the subject matter, it is the literary quality. Douglass writes with a control and a precision and a moral intelligence that demolishes any remaining pretension that enslaved people lack the intellectual capacity for self-expression. His narrative is a literary achievement. And it is a challenge to any writer who would write about slavery, the challenge of doing justice to an experience you have not lived, of not reducing it to sentiment or spectacle. She also reads Solomon Northup, whose 12 years a slave she will encounter later, and various shorter narratives that circulate through the abolitionist network. She reads the reports of the American Anti-Slavery Society. She reads Theodore Wells' American Slavery as It Is, which was compiled from testimony and newspaper accounts and which serves, she will later confirm, as one of her primary research sources for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Wells' book is not pleasant reading. It is organized as a systematic documentation of the practice of slavery, not its theory or its economics but its practice, the daily reality of it, the specific forms of violence and deprivation that the institution requires and produces. Reading it, Harriet is doing something that requires real courage, not the physical courage of crossing a river in winter, but the moral and emotional courage of refusing to look away. The Cincinnati years give her the material. But they give her something else too, something less tangible but equally important. They give her a perspective. The perspective of someone who has lived at the border of two worlds, the free North and the slave South, long enough to understand both the arguments and the human costs. She is not writing from a distance. She is not a New England moralist who has never left her study. She has been 18 years at the river's edge. She has seen what she has seen. When the family finally leaves Cincinnati in the spring of 1850, Harriet packs up a household of staggering complexity, 7 children, years of accumulated books and papers and furniture and domestic equipment, and loads it onto a steamboat for the journey back to the east. She stands on the deck as the city recedes, as the river widens behind them, and she carries with her everything those 18 years have deposited. She carries the river. She carries the faces. She carries the stories. She carries the grief of Charlie's death and the exhaustion of a decade and a half of relentless domestic labor, and the conviction, growing now into something fierce and certain, that she has something she must say. She is 38 years old. She has been a professional writer for 17 years. She has published a book, dozens of stories, hundreds of magazine pieces. She has educated herself in the only way a woman of her time and circumstances could, through reading, through listening, through paying close and relentless attention to the world around her. She is ready. Even if she does not know, quite yet, how ready she is. Part 12, The Night Before the Book, Brunswick, 1850, and the Vision at the Table. There is a kitchen in Brunswick, Maine, on a winter night in 1850 or early 1851. The house is quiet in the way that a house with 7 children is quiet only late at night, when the last child has finally fallen asleep and the last fire has been banked for the night. The kitchen smells of bread and wood smoke and the particular cold, clean air of a Maine winter, which is different from the cold air of Ohio, sharper, less heavy, with a quality of clarity to it, as if the cold itself has opinions. At the kitchen table, there is a woman. She is small, she has always been small, barely 5 feet tall, which people who know her find slightly improbable given the force of her personality. She has dark eyes that are, in the candlelight, difficult to read. They are the eyes of someone whose interior life is very active and not always fully legible from the outside. She has a pen. She has paper. She has, for the moment, the silence she needs. This is where it begins. Not in a grand gesture. Not with a dramatic announcement. But here, in this kitchen, on this winter night, at this table. She has been thinking about the book for months, perhaps, in some sense, for years. She has been accumulating it, storing it, carrying it the way you carry something very heavy over a long distance, adjusting your grip every so often but never putting it down. And now she picks up the pen. She will later describe the experience of beginning Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms that are, for her, almost mystical. She will say that certain scenes came to her complete, fully formed, as if delivered rather than invented. She will say that the death of Uncle Tom came to her first, and that she wept as she wrote it. She will say that she felt, throughout the writing of the book, that she was not entirely its author, that she was the instrument through which something larger was speaking. We can take this partly literally and partly metaphorically. The experience she is describing is the experience that writers across centuries have described when they are working at their best, the sense that the material has its own logic, its own necessity, that the characters have their own reality and must be followed rather than directed. It is a real experience, even if the theological framing is specific to Harriet's own tradition. But it is also possible to take it quite literally. She has been carrying this book for so long that when she finally begins to write it, it does come with unusual speed and confidence. The stories she has heard, the faces she has seen, the grief she has lived through, the theology she has wrestled with for 30 years, all of it has been preparing for this moment of release. When a river has been building behind a dam for long enough, the opening comes with tremendous force. She begins writing, and the writing does not stop. She writes in the kitchen, she writes at the parlor table, she writes by candlelight and lamplight in the cold gray light of Maine winter mornings. She writes around the children, around their needs and their noise and their demands on her attention, finding the intervals of quiet and filling them absolutely. She writes to the editors of the National Era, an anti-slavery newspaper in Washington, and proposes what she describes as a series of sketches about slavery. She is modest in her framing, sketches, not a novel, a series rather than a sustained narrative. Perhaps she does not yet know how large the thing she is writing will grow. Or perhaps she knows and is wise enough not to say it too plainly, in case the editors hesitate. The National Era agrees. They begin publishing the pieces in serial form in June 1851. And the response begins almost immediately. Letters arrive. From readers who have been moved, who have wept, who have passed the newspaper to their neighbors and their friends and their ministers. From women who recognize in Harriet's characters something of themselves. From abolitionists who feel that the argument they have been making in political and legal terms is now, for the first time, being made in a language that reaches people who do not usually attend anti-slavery lectures. The serial runs for 40 weeks, far longer than originally planned. The story grows under her hands, taking on dimensions she had not initially anticipated, pulling in characters and plotlines that arrive with the inevitability of something that was waiting to be written. Tom. Eliza. Little Eva. St. Clair. Miss Ophelia. Simon Legree. These are not, primarily, polemical constructs, though they carry polemic within them. They are characters, in the full sense of the word, people with interior lives, with contradictions, with the capacity to surprise their creator. She writes the death of little Eva. She writes it in the knowledge of her own Charlie, not as a direct transcription of her grief, but as a transformation of it, a use of the specific knowledge that only grief can give. She writes it weeping, according to her later accounts. She writes it because it must be written, because the argument she is making about slavery requires you to feel the weight of a child's death, the way slavery routinely produces such deaths, through separation, through violence, through the theft of the very possibility of secure and loving family life. She writes Tom. Tom is the most difficult creation in the book, the one most debated and most misunderstood in the century and a half since the book's publication. He is intended as an exemplar of spiritual courage, a man who responds to the violence of the institution with a radical Christian love and non-resistance that Harriet intends as heroic rather than passive. Whether she succeeds entirely is a question that later generations will argue with intensity. But in 1851, sitting at her kitchen table, she is writing Tom with all the sincerity and care at her command, trying to create a black man of dignity and depth, at a time when such portrayals were almost entirely absent from American literature. She is also, it must be said, limited by the perspective of a white New England woman of the 1850s, with all the blind spots that entails. She is not writing from inside the experience of slavery. She is writing from alongside it, from the shore on the other side of the river, from the accumulated force of stories heard and texts read and moral urgency felt over 2 decades. She will be criticized for this, in later generations, fairly and with precision. But the criticism does not diminish the sincerity of the effort, or the effect the book produces in its own time. Uncle Tom's Cabin is published in book form on March 20, 1852. Within a week, the first edition of 5,000 copies is sold. Within a year, 300,000 copies have been sold in the United States alone, and the book is being translated into languages Harriet Stowe had perhaps never heard spoken. Within 2 years, it has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. The response is unlike anything American publishing has seen. People read it aloud to each other in parlors. Ministers preach sermons about it. It is banned in several southern states. It is credited, including, famously, by Abraham Lincoln himself, who reportedly upon meeting Harriet Stowe in 1862 said something to the effect of, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war, with accelerating the conflict that will eventually end slavery." Whether any single book can bear that weight of historical causation is a question worth asking. Probably not, in any simple or direct sense. The Civil War has roots that go far deeper than any novel. But Uncle Tom's Cabin does something real and significant. It makes slavery emotionally and morally legible to people who had previously been able to keep it at arm's length. It puts specific human faces on an abstraction. It asks you to feel the cost of the institution in terms you understand, in terms of mothers and children and the love between them, and having felt it, it asks what you are going to do about what you feel. This is what all the years before the book were building toward. Not a political argument. Not a legal brief. Not even a theological treatise, though theology is woven through every page. A story. The oldest technology of human connection. One person saying to another, "Let me tell you what it is like. Let me make you feel it." Let me put you close enough to the truth that you cannot pretend you don't know. Harriet Beecher Stowe was 50 years old when Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, and she had been preparing to write it since she was 4 years old and her mother died in a house in Litchfield, Connecticut, and she learned for the first time what it meant to lose what you cannot replace. She wrote it in a kitchen, by candlelight, in the margins of a life that was already completely full. She wrote it because she had seen the river and she could not unsee the river, and because she believed, not naively, not without cost, but with a conviction that had been tested for decades and had not broken, that love was the most powerful force available to human beings, and that stories were one of the ways love traveled. She wrote it because someone had to. And she was the one. Closing meditation. And so we come, slowly, gently, back to the quiet. Back to the body resting on the bed, to the breath moving in and out without effort, to the darkness behind the closed eyes that is not empty but full of images, of faces, of a small woman in a cold kitchen with a pen and an ocean of things she needed to say. We have traveled far tonight, and yet we have gone no further than the human heart, which is the only country that really matters, the only geography that contains all the others. Think, if you like, of Harriet at 4 years old, standing in the house on the hill in Litchfield, learning the shape of absence. Think of her at 13, sitting in the back of a lamplit room listening to her own words being read aloud and feeling, for the first time, the particular electricity of being heard. Think of her at the Ohio River, at dusk, watching the water move south, holding the stories she has gathered, not yet knowing what to do with them but knowing, with absolute certainty, that she must do something. Think of her at the kitchen table, in the deep quiet of a Maine winter, the house asleep around her, the candle burning, the pen moving. She was afraid, sometimes. She was often exhausted. She doubted. She grieved. She managed a household and raised 7 children and worried about money and prayed to a God she was always in the process of understanding more fully. And through all of it, she kept going. She kept writing. She kept paying attention. She kept refusing to look away from what the world showed her, however hard looking was. That is the story of Harriet Beecher Stowe before she wrote the book. Not a story of sudden inspiration or miraculous genius, but the slower, quieter, more human story of a life spent in preparation. A life spent becoming equal to what it was asked to do. Let that thought rest gently now, like a book closed at the end of a chapter. Feel the weight of your body. Feel the ground beneath you, solid and patient. Let your breath deepen. Let the images of the night drift away softly, like leaves on the surface of a river, moving on, carried by a current that knows exactly where it is going. You have traveled far enough for one night. Rest now. Rest. Sleep is here. Let it come. Like a river finding the sea, effortlessly and at last. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.